there is a question that every intelligence officer learns to fear. Not the dramatic ones. Not the questions that arrive with handcuffs or a polygraph or a summons to the director's office. The question they fear is smaller than that. It sounds like this: why does this weigh more than it should? That question ended 4 years of work. It burned an asset. It changed what Mossad was permitted to do inside one of the most intelligence-saturated cities in the world. And it was asked not by a counterintelligence officer, not by a foreign service sweeping for bugs, but by a municipal maintenance worker on a Thursday afternoon in January 2009, standing at the base of a streetlight on a quiet corner of Vienna's 2nd District, holding a junction box in both hands. He was just doing his job. That was enough. Before we go further, here is something for you, because you clearly cannot get enough of stories like these. We put together a limited edition ebook, a collection of real operations where an entire intelligence network rested on something as ordinary as a streetlight, a wall socket, a piece of furniture nobody ever looks at twice. The devices that were never supposed to be found. The years of work that ended because a city changed and nobody was watching it change. What it actually takes to hide an operation inside the world itself. These are the cases that never reached a public file. If this is the world you cannot look away from, this book is where it lives. Scan the QR code on the screen to grab your copy or click the link in the description. Then stay with us, because this story is just getting started. The man who built the system that Foreman would eventually find was a Mossad technical officer who went by the operational designation Yosef. Not his name. A designation. In the world he worked in, names were inconveniences. Yosef had spent the early part of his career developing what the intelligence community calls passive collection architecture. The concept is deceptively simple. You embed a listening or recording device into something that already belongs in the environment. Not a briefcase, not a pen, something that no one would ever think to question. A ceiling tile, a wall socket, a piece of street furniture. The advantage is that there is no surveillance footprint. No officer visiting regularly, no vehicle parked too long on the same block. No pattern that a counterintelligence sweep will catch. The device simply exists, as it has always existed, as part of the city around it. The disadvantage is the one Yosef would spend the rest of his career thinking about. Vienna, in 2005, was exactly the kind of city that made passive collection appealing. It had been a station city for intelligence services since the end of the Second World War. Neutral ground, diplomatically saturated. Home to the International Atomic Energy Agency, OPEC, and a spread of United Nations bodies that made it one of the most surveilled and counter-surveilled capitals in the world. Every major service had a presence. Most of them knew it about each other. Mossad's official station was embedded inside the Israeli embassy on Anton Frank Gasse. Officers carried diplomatic cover. They moved carefully within well-understood limits. The Austrians knew they were there. The arrangement was professional, contained, and carefully managed. What the Austrians did not know about was the parallel architecture. The target that brought Yosef to Vienna was a building on Scherninggasse, in the Leopoldstadt district. 3rd floor. An office used intermittently by a procurement official attached to the Iranian mission. The official held no predictable meetings with persons who could be recruited. His mobile phone was monitored but noisy. A microphone inside the office required a black entry that the Vienna station assessed as too high risk given Austrian counterintelligence activity in the diplomatic quarter. Yosef looked at the building. He looked at the corner. He looked at the streetlight directly outside the 3rd floor window and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent years turning ordinary objects into instruments of state, exactly what he was looking at. The device Yosef designed was precise in the way that objects designed to be invisible must be precise. A cavity machined into the existing lamp fixture housing. A directional microphone array aimed at the window. A digital storage module with a 48-hour buffer. A short-range inductive transmission coil that allowed a technician, passing within 3 meters of the pole, to pull stored audio without ever touching the fixture or climbing the pole. A pass in a vehicle, a pedestrian with a bag, contact-free. No RF signature, except during a 2-second transmission window. No replacement hardware. No new equipment visible to any inspector who might walk past. The device would draw power from the existing municipal lighting circuit. It would weigh, including all components, 14 grams more than the standard junction box. Yosef did not consider this a problem. The man who ran the operation once it was in place was a different officer. Field designation, Dagen, not the director, a handler. A man who had been running Vienna collections for 6 years when the Cherningasse post was established, and who understood the city the way experienced field officers understand their cities, not as geography but as a system of predictable behaviors, reliable patterns, and manageable risks. Dagen was methodical, he was cautious, and he was, by the time the device went live in March of 2005, deeply invested in what it might produce. The target, referred to in operational documentation by the cryptonym Gardner, was believed to be managing the European side of a procurement network acquiring components for Iran's centrifuge program. Carbon fiber composite materials, precision-bearing assemblies, components that were not available through legitimate Iranian purchasing channels and that were, in the right configuration, useful for the kind of enrichment infrastructure that was occupying a significant portion of Mossad's analytical attention. Gardner used the office because the meetings he held there were not for embassy records. He met contacts who did not appear in diplomatic registers. He stood at the window when he took calls, cigarette in hand, single-pane glass between his voice and the street below. The first retrieval pass, in April of 2005, returned 43 minutes of audio. Dagen reviewed the transcript summary and filed a report that, by all available inference, landed well at divisional level. The retrieval schedule that Dagen established was designed to produce no detectable pattern over a 6-month window. Never the same day of the week twice in a row, never the same hour. A panel van registered to a fictitious Austrian courier company, one of 3 such cover registrations the Vienna station maintained. The van slowed. The officer inside held a receiver the size of a paperback book. 2 seconds, the buffer downloaded. The van moved on. For 3 years, this worked without incident. What Dagen did not know, in those years, was that the world around the device was already beginning to change. In 2007, the European Union began circulating energy efficiency guidelines that would, in the following years, push municipal governments across the continent to begin assessing their existing street lighting infrastructure for replacement. Vienna's city administration noted the guidelines. A budget review was scheduled for 2008. The second municipal district, the Leopoldstadt, was included in the pilot assessment. Dagen was not watching municipal infrastructure policy. There was no reason he would be. It was not, in the threat model that governed his operation, a relevant variable. It was already relevant. In August of 2008, something went wrong. Not on Cherningasse, in a market district 3 kilometers away. A brush pass operation that the Vienna station ran as a separate collection task. An Austrian counterintelligence officer conducting routine surveillance of a known Mossad contact photographed the panel van at the wrong moment. The van's registration was flagged. Not arrested, not confronted. Flagged. The vehicle was now known to Austrian counterintelligence. Dagen was informed within the week. He assessed the risk. The flagged vehicle had never been used on Cherningasse during any period when he had reason to believe active surveillance was in the area. Its connection to the Leopoldstadt district existed only in operational files that Austrian counterintelligence did not have access to. He retired the vehicle. He assessed the risk to the Cherningasse post as low. He did not suspend operations. He dispatched a second vehicle, clean registration, to resume the retrieval schedule. The question he did not ask himself, the question that would, in retrospect, define everything that followed, was this: if the first vehicle was burned, what else had been seen that he did not yet know about? In November of 2008, a municipal infrastructure inspector named Herr K. was conducting an energy efficiency assessment of the lamp fixtures on Tscherninggasse. He was 11 years into a career of methodical, unremarkable infrastructure review. He noted, in the assessment form he filed at the end of that afternoon, that the junction box on the corner pole had what he described as an apparent non-standard conduit configuration. He noted, separately, that a panel van appeared to slow near the pole during the period he was present. He included both observations because he included everything. That was how he had done the job for 11 years. The assessment form went into an administrative queue. Dagen's second vehicle made its retrieval pass that same afternoon, 3 hours before Herr K. packed up his clipboard and walked back to the municipal depot. The audio from that pass contained, among other things, a conversation in Farsi that Dagen's analysts would spend the following weeks transcribing and assessing. Neither Dagen nor his analysts knew that the transcription work was already pointless, that the thread they were pulling had already, somewhere in the administrative machinery of a city they thought they understood, begun to unravel. What no one inside the operation knew, in November of 2008, was what a form filed by an infrastructure inspector would set in motion. That is not the kind of thing you put in a threat model. The form that Herr K. filed on a November afternoon in 2008 did not travel quickly. That is the nature of administrative machinery. It moves at the speed of its own procedures, indifferent to what is happening in the operational world that occasionally intersects with it. The form entered a queue. The queue was processed in order. 6 weeks passed. In those 6 weeks, Dagen ran 2 more retrieval passes. Both returned audio. Gardner had met a contact in the first week of December, a conversation that ran to nearly an hour. The transcript, when it came back from the analysts, contained references to a Rotterdam logistics intermediary that Dagen had flagged in a previous report. He elevated the finding. It reached the right desks. Inside the operational record, November and December of 2008 looked like the operation was performing well. It was. That was not the problem. The problem was not inside the operation. It was in the queue. In the first week of January 2009, a city electrical engineer opened Herr K.'s assessment form and read the notation about the non-standard conduit configuration on the Tscherninggasse corner pole. He cross-referenced it against the maintenance log for that pole. The maintenance log showed no work orders for that fixture in the previous 4 years. This was not alarming. Maintenance logs in aging municipal infrastructure were frequently incomplete, but the engineer was working in the context of a cable theft advisory that the district coordinator had circulated the previous winter, following a rash of incidents in which copper wire had been stripped from relay boxes in the 6th district. The advisory asked electrical staff to flag any infrastructure anomaly that could not be explained by existing maintenance records. The notation qualified. The engineer forwarded it to the district infrastructure coordinator with a single line, flagged per January 2008 advisory, physical inspection recommended. The coordinator called the Bundespolizei. A police technical unit was dispatched to Tscherninggasse on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of January 2009. They opened the junction box at 4:15 p.m. They found the device in 40 minutes. Dagen did not know. This is the operational reality that makes what followed so difficult to reconstruct cleanly, because for the people inside the operation, January 2009 looked normal. The retrieval schedule had a planned gap in the first 3 weeks of the month. No pass was due, no contact was expected. Gardner had not used the office since mid-December, which was consistent with his pattern during the Austrian holiday period. Nothing was wrong because nothing visible had changed. That is the specific cruelty of what passive collection failure looks like from the inside. There is no alarm, no signal. The device does not report its own discovery. The buffer does not send a warning when hands that should not be there open the housing and reach inside. The operation simply continues, in the minds of the people running it, as though the instrument it depends on still exists. The device was removed from the junction box on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, it was in the hands of the BVT, the Austrian Domestic Intelligence Service. By the following Tuesday, it had been photographed, documented, and sent to their technical analysis unit. Dagen was running a retrieval schedule against a pole that held nothing but a standard junction box and the memory of what had been there. The BVT's technical assessment took 11 days. What they were looking at was not consumer electronics. The device was engineered at a level of precision, inconsistent with criminal capability, and inconsistent with Austrian domestic law enforcement technology. The inductive transmission protocol was not a design that appeared in any commercial surveillance product available in the European market. The power management system, drawing from the municipal lighting circuit without producing a detectable load variance, was, by the assessment of the BVT technical officer who examined it, the work of an organization with significant engineering resources and operational experience in urban collection. 2 services were assessed as the most probable candidates. The targeting logic narrowed it further. The building on Scherninggasse, its occupants, the specific window the microphone array was oriented toward. The Austrians were not naive about what the Iranian mission did in Vienna. They were not naive about which services monitored it. They did not go public. They made a different calculation entirely. Inside Keshet, the Mossad operational division running the Iranian nuclear proliferation account, the first indication that something had changed in Vienna arrived not as a report from Dagen, but as a pattern anomaly in a separate data stream. An IAEA contact who reported informally on Iranian diplomatic behavior in Vienna noted, in passing, that Iranian mission personnel had significantly reduced their movement in the Leopoldstadt district in the second half of January. Not a complete withdrawal, a reduction. Meetings that had been held at off-site locations were being shifted to the embassy itself. A procurement contact who had been active in Viennese financial channels had gone quiet. The contact did not know why. He offered it as an observation, not an assessment. A Keshet analyst ran it against existing collection. Gardiner had not used the Scherninggasse office since mid-December. His travel record, monitored through passport channels, showed no Vienna arrivals in January. This was not, by itself, outside the range of normal variation. But the analyst noted the combination, reduced Iranian movement in Leopoldstadt. Gardiner absent, procurement network quieter than baseline. She flagged it internally. The flag did not reach Dagen. This is the fracture that would later define how the failure was assessed internally. Keshet had a partial picture forming at the divisional level, and the field handler running the operation was not inside the loop in which that picture was being assembled. Dagen was managing the collection schedule. Division was beginning to read the environment around it. Neither was sharing with the other in real time. In a functioning operational structure, the flag from the analyst would have triggered an immediate call to the Vienna station. It did not. It entered its own queue, marked for discussion at the next scheduled review. The next scheduled review was 10 days away. The BVT, in the 3rd week of January, made a decision about what to do with what they had found. They did not arrest anyone. They did not contact the Israeli embassy. They did not publish. They placed a physical surveillance team on the Scherninggasse block and waited. The logic was straightforward. Whoever had placed the device would eventually come to service it. When they came, the Austrians would know who they were looking at. They waited for 3 weeks. No one came. The retrieval schedule gap held through January. Dagen's next planned pass was the 1st week of February. In the 3rd week of their waiting, the BVT made a second decision. Through a back channel, an Austrian intelligence liaison with Iranian diplomatic contacts, a signal was passed. Carefully constructed. Ambiguous by design. It indicated that something of interest had been found in the 2nd district. It did not specify what or where or who had placed it. It was sufficient. Gardner stopped using the Scherninggasse office on a Thursday in late January. He did not return. The 1st week of February. Dagen's courier made the retrieval pass. The receiver returned nothing. The buffer was empty. He logged it. He checked the schedule. Gardner had been absent for 6 weeks. but 6 weeks was within the range of normal variation. The device might simply have recorded nothing worth transmitting. He noted it and scheduled the next pass. The next pass also returned nothing. He pulled the collection log and looked at the timeline. The last audio retrieved had been dated November 14, 2008. 11 weeks. Even accounting for the holiday period and Gardner's travel pattern, 11 weeks without a single recorded meeting was outside the range of anything the operation had produced in 4 years. He sent a technical officer to make a diagnostic pass with an extended receiver. The diagnostic returned a null response. Not corrupted, not degraded, null. The transmission protocol was reaching for a device that was not there. Dagan understood. He did not immediately know when the device had been found. He did not know by whom. He did not know what had followed. He knew only that it was gone. He sat with that knowledge for what the operational record suggests was several hours before he began to reconstruct the sequence, the November pass. The second vehicle, clean registration, dispatched in September after he retired the burned van. The inspector's assessment form, which he did not know about and could not have known about, but which he could now infer from the shape of what had happened. The burned vehicle in August. His decision in August. The question he had not asked himself. He wrote a report. He sent it to Keshet. He described the device as compromised, the source as almost certainly dry, and the cover architecture for the Vienna passive collection program as burned beyond the specific post. He waited for a response. It came 48 hours later. The response from Keshet contained a line that took Dagan a moment to process. It read, approximately, "Assessment conducted at division level indicates the device was likely found in mid-January." Operational posture was adjusted at that time. You were not notified because it was assessed that field modification of the retrieval schedule might draw attention to the operating service. This assessment was incorrect. Apologies. Dagan read it twice. Division had known. Not before him by hours, before him by 3 weeks. The partial picture the analyst had flagged, the Leopoldstadt movement reduction, Gardner's absence, the procurement network going quiet had resolved, at divisional level, into a working conclusion that the device had been found. And the calculation they had made was that informing Dagan, who would logically suspend the retrieval schedule, would confirm to the Austrians that the operating service had registered its loss, so they had left him running passes against an empty pole. His ignorance had been operationally useful to them, they had used it. The apology was one sentence. The 3 weeks were not coming back, and Gardner, wherever he was by the first week of February 2009, was no longer in Vienna. What the Austrians had told the Iranians, and what the Iranians had done with what they were told, was a question that Dagan did not yet have the answer to. It was the question that would define everything that mattered about what came next. The 48 hours between Dagan sending his report and receiving Keshet's response were not passive hours. He did not wait at his desk. That is not how field officers work when they believe an operation may be compromised. He went back through the retrieval logs. Every pass since September 2008. The dates, the times, the vehicle, the route taken before and after. He was looking for the moment. The specific pass that had been seen, if any pass had been seen. He was trying to locate the error in space and time, the way a surgeon looks for the source of a bleed. He found the November pass, the date, the approximate window of time. He had no way of knowing that an infrastructure inspector had been on that block that same afternoon. He had no surveillance record of the inspector's presence, no report of any observation. What he had was the only pass that fell within the period of Gardner's subsequent absence, which began in the back half of November and had not ended. He wrote November in his notes and underlined it once. Then he crossed it out. Because if the device had been found in November, the Austrians would have moved within days. They would have swept the area. There would have been indicators, a change in foot traffic patterns near the building, increased municipal activity on the block, something observable through the station's routine area monitoring. There had been nothing. November to January was 2 months. No service sits on a discovery like that for 2 months without doing something that leaves a trace. He revised his estimate. Late December, early January, a scheduled inspection, not a surveillance discovery, an administrative one. He was wrong, but he was wrong in a way that made him feel, temporarily, that the damage was more contained than it was. His second wrong assumption was about Gardner. Gardner had been absent since mid-November. Dagan knew this from the collection logs. What he was telling himself, in the days after the diagnostic null return, was that Gardner's absence might predate the discovery. That the procurement official had simply shifted his meeting venue for reasons unrelated to surveillance. This happened. Targets changed behavior. It did not always mean they knew they were being watched. If Gardner had changed venue independently, then the 4 years of collection retained its value. The network was still intact. The intelligence product was still valid. The operational loss was the device, not the source picture. Dagan wrote this assessment in a preliminary note before Keshet's response arrived. He was building the case for a narrower loss than the one that was actually waiting for him. When the response arrived and he read that line, operational posture was adjusted at that time. The note he had written became immediately, completely obsolete. He did not file it. The question of what to do next was not his to answer alone. Keshet had already been making decisions without him for 3 weeks. That relationship between the field handler and the divisional desk had shifted during those 3 weeks in a way that could not be undone by a notification and an apology. Dagan requested a secure call. He wanted to understand the sequence of Keshet's realization. He wanted to know what had been passed to the Austrians or inferred from Austrian behavior. He wanted to know whether Gardner's absence had been assessed as awareness or coincidence. The call happened the day after the response arrived. The divisional officer he spoke to was not the person who had written the response. That person was on travel. Dagan was speaking to a deputy who had been briefed but who had not been inside the decision-making during the 3 weeks in question. The deputy confirmed that the signal passed to the Iranian liaison through the Austrian back channel had been tracked. The BVT had initiated that pass in the 3rd week of January. The content had been ambiguous. Keshet's assessment was that Gardner had received enough of a signal to change his behavior, but probably did not know the specifics of what had been found, who had placed it, or what it had collected. Probably. Dagan asked what the confidence level was on that assessment. The deputy paused, then he said that the confidence level was moderate. Moderate? On the question of what Gardner knew, and therefore on the question of what the Iranians now understood about the exposure of their procurement network, the confidence level was moderate. Dagan asked whether there was any scenario in which the Austrians had passed more specificity than the back-channel summary suggested. The deputy said he would check and follow up. He did not follow up that day. In the 3rd week of February, Keshet made the decision to formally close the Cherningasse collection operation and begin the process of retiring the cover architecture associated with it. The 2 remaining courier vehicle registrations were flagged for decommission. The fictitious courier company registration was allowed to lapse. The technical officer who had built the modification to the junction box, and who was the only person outside Yosef capable of identifying the device's origin from its physical components, was moved from Vienna to a different posting. This last decision was made quickly. Too quickly, Dagan would later argue, because the movement of a technical officer out of Vienna station immediately after a device discovery was exactly the kind of personnel shift that a watching counterintelligence service would note and add to its file. He raised this on a follow-up call. He was told the movement had been assessed as low risk because the officer's cover identity was not associated with the Cherningasse area. Dagan did not agree with this assessment. He did not have the standing, at this point, to do more than note his disagreement in the call record. The technical officer's transfer was completed in the last week of February. There was a moment, in the 1st week of March, that felt like a controlled landing. Gardner's transfer out of Vienna was logged through passport monitoring on a Thursday. He was no longer in the city. His presence in the operational environment, the specific threat that his awareness posed, was physically resolved. He was gone. The procurement network had gone quiet, but had not, as far as Keshet could determine from the intelligence picture, been explicitly rolled up. The Austrians had not gone public. The Israeli embassy had received no formal communication, no démarche, no request for explanation. The silence felt briefly like a successful containment. Dagon wrote a situation assessment in the first week of March that reflected cautious relief. The loss was real, the device was gone. Gardner was burned as a collection target. But the operation had not produced a diplomatic incident. The station was intact. The cover architecture, though retired, had not been publicly attributed. The Austrians, by their silence, appeared to have chosen a managed outcome over a confrontational one. He filed the assessment. He received a brief acknowledgement from Keshet. 2 days later, a BVT liaison officer requested a meeting with the Israeli embassy's station chief. The meeting was not a confrontation. That is the detail that makes it harder to assess cleanly, because a confrontation would have been legible. A confrontation has a defined shape: accusation, denial, negotiation, outcome. What the BVT liaison officer delivered was something less structured and more corrosive. He presented 3 photographs: the junction box, external, as found, the junction box interior, with the device in place, the device itself removed on a white examination surface. He did not say who he believed had placed it. He did not make an accusation. He described the photographs as documentation of something found during a routine infrastructure inspection in the 2nd District. He said the BVT had completed its technical assessment. He said the assessment had been shared with relevant Austrian authorities. He asked, conversationally, whether the station chief had any observations. The station chief said he did not. The liaison officer thanked him and left. The station chief reported the meeting to Tel Aviv within the hour. The report described the meeting as a signal, not a declaration. A signal. The Austrians knew. They had chosen to communicate that they knew through a method that left no formal record of accusation, no official exchange that could become a diplomatic file, no moment that either side was required to respond to publicly. It was a clean way to begin a negotiation that neither side would ever officially acknowledge was happening. Dagon read the station chief's report and understood, with a completeness he had not felt at any previous point in the sequence, how far the loss extended. Not the device, not Gardner. The negotiation that was now beginning was going to cost something structural, something that the station had held for years without ever having to articulate, because it had never been formally at risk. What it was going to cost, he did not yet know precisely. But the meeting had happened. The photographs existed. The Austrians had calculated what they wanted, and they were going to ask for it. The question was no longer what had been lost. The question was what they were going to have to give to keep the rest. The negotiation that followed the BVT liaison's visit did not have a name. It did not produce a signed document. It did not appear in any diplomatic record that has since been made public. What it produced was a change in the operational reality of the Vienna station that every officer who worked there in the years following 2009 experienced as a physical constraint on what they were permitted to attempt. The Austrians did not ask for an expulsion. They did not ask for a public acknowledgement. What they asked for, through the back-channel architecture that intelligence services use precisely because it leaves no formal record, was structural. They wanted consultation rights over technical collection operations, targeting third-country nationals on Austrian soil, not notification after the fact. Consultation before. This sounds, at a distance, like a bureaucratic adjustment. It was not. It was a fundamental reorientation of what the Vienna station could do and how quickly it could do it. Passive collection against Iranian procurement targets, the specific mission that the Chernin-Gassa post had served, required moving faster than consultation allowed. The procurement networks moved. The personnel rotated. The windows in which collection was possible opened and closed on timelines that did not accommodate a pre-approval process with a foreign service whose interests were not identical to Israel's. The informal operational freedom the Vienna station had exercised for decades, The ability to run technical collection against third-party targets without Austrian knowledge was not revoked. It was restructured into a form that made it, in practice, significantly more difficult to exercise. The Austrians had extracted this concession in exchange for their silence. It was a rational outcome from their position. From the station's position, it was a permanent narrowing of the operational space, purchased at the price of one junction box and 11 weeks of undetected exposure. The intelligence thread that the Cherningasse Post had been pulling did not survive the winter of 2009. The procurement network that Gardner had been managing out of Vienna went quiet in early 2009 across its entire visible surface. Not Gardner alone. The logistics intermediaries, the shell company accounts in Austrian banking infrastructure, the contacts who had been active in European financial channels for years. They did not close in sequence, which would have suggested a rolling response to specific intelligence. They went quiet together, which suggested a centralized decision. The Iranians had received a signal through the BVT back channel that was deliberately ambiguous. What they knew was that something had been found near a space their man used. What they did not know, what Keshet assessed with moderate confidence they did not know, was the duration of collection, the content of what had been captured, or the specific identity of the operating service. Moderate confidence. The network's simultaneous shutdown suggested that the Iranians had decided, in the face of ambiguity, to assume the worst. They did not know exactly what had been taken, so they treated everything the network had touched as potentially compromised and rebuilt from a posture of zero. This meant that 4 years of collection, 340 hours of audio, 2 interdiction operations, a detailed picture of how the network moved components through European logistics channels, had produced an intelligence product that was now, in its forward-looking value, largely exhausted. The network would reconstitute. It always did. But it would reconstitute differently in different cities, through different intermediaries, undercover architectures that had not been inside the Cherningasse audio record. Mossad would be starting over on a network they had spent 4 years learning to read. The doctrine change that emerged from the Vienna failure was real but imperfect in the way that doctrine changes, produced by operational failure, are always imperfect. The life cycle review, the mandatory 12-month environmental reassessment for any device embedded in public infrastructure, was adopted inside the Technical Operations Division. It addressed the environmental drift problem that Yosef had identified. It was a structural improvement. What it did not address was the notification gap. The 3 weeks in which Keshet had held a working conclusion about the device's discovery and had not informed Dagon. That gap was not primarily a procedural failure. It was a judgment call made under pressure that the field handler's ignorance was operationally useful. The policy that followed, notification within 24 hours of divisional confirmation, regardless of active deception considerations, addressed the symptom. The underlying tendency inside any hierarchical intelligence organization under operational pressure to make use of what is available rather than what is right was not addressable by policy alone. Whether it recurred in different operations, in different stations, in different configurations, is not something that can be assessed from outside the institution. Dagon did not return to field operations in Vienna. He was moved to an analytical role within 18 months of the February 2009 diagnostic null return. The official record, such as it is, describes the move in neutral terms: a rotation, a reassignment consistent with career development. What the official record does not describe is the specific texture of those 18 months. Running a station in a city where you have just negotiated away a significant piece of operational freedom on behalf of an operation you ran, because of a decision you made in August about a burned vehicle and a risk you assessed as manageable. The decision he made in August 2008 was reasonable within the information he had. That is the honest assessment. He did not have the inspector's report. He did not have the energy efficiency review timeline. He did not know that a retrieval pass in November would be observed by a man with a clipboard who had been standing at that pole for the same reason that all municipal workers stand at poles, because his job required it. What Dagon had in August was a burned vehicle, a clean replacement, and a 4-year operation producing intelligence that was reaching the right desks and mattering. He made the call that most experienced handlers in his position would have made. He made it in an environment that had already begun to change around the device, in ways that no threat model he had built in 2005 had anticipated, because the model was built for a static city, and Vienna in 2008 was not the city it had been in 2005. That gap between the world the operation was designed for and the world it was running in was not something he could have seen from inside the operation without tools and habits that the organization had not yet built. He had been operating without a life cycle review in an environment that had drifted past the assumptions embedded in the original design. The device cost 14 grams. The operation cost 4 years. What Dagon lost that could not be recovered was the specific professional confidence, particular to field officers who have run something well for a long time, that he understood his environment well enough to manage it. He did not retire immediately. He worked, he contributed. But Vienna was the last station he ran, and the specific kind of work that defined what he was good at, placing and managing technical collection in complex urban environments, was the work he never returned to. The cases that built the doctrine behind operations like this one, passive urban collection, infrastructure concealment, the specific methodology of hiding a listening post inside the furniture of a city, are not in any public file. Some of them are in what we put together in the ebook in the description below. It covers the operational record of deep cover collection methods, the cases, the failures, the doctrine changes that followed, and the specific reasoning intelligence services used when they decided that the city itself was the best cover an asset could have. The link is in the description. If you have worked in infrastructure, in municipal services, in any environment where the weight of an ordinary object is something you notice, you already understand how this ended before we told you. Leave that in the comments, and if there is an operation you want us to cover next, name it there. We will read it.